The first days of June settled over the small Virginia settlement with a heaviness that felt older than the soil itself, the kind of heat that softened wooden planks and made every footstep sound more exhausted than the person taking it. At dawn, the fields carried a pale gray mist that clung low to the ground, refusing to rise even as the first orders of the day drifted from the overseer's porch like a ritual repeated so long it no longer required intent. Elijah had grown accustomed to the sound of those instructions, not because he accepted them, but because they formed the rhythm against which every enslaved life was forced to move. Even before words were spoken, he could tell from the timbre of the morning, the quickness of boots across the packed clay, the tone of the overseer's cough, the way the horses snorted at their reins, what kind of day awaited the people on the property. The young man stepped from the small cabin he shared with two others, the early humidity already dampening the thin fabric of his shirt. He moved quietly, though no one had instructed him to. Silence had become a language in itself, a form of safety for those who possessed no legitimate claim to their own time. The sun had not yet fully cleared the tree line, but the outlines of the settlement were already visible. The main house elevated slightly above the field, the wash house crouched near the well, the line of cabins where families were organized not by kinship, but by convenience of labor. Every structure bore marks of use more than of care, the kind of aging that came from necessity rather than ownership. From his vantage point near the cabin door, Elijah could see the first contradictions of the day taking shape. The land, though fertile and green, felt like a trap arranged symmetrically. The fences were not high, but the distances between properties, the patrols, the roving men hired from nearby counties, and the unspoken knowledge of the consequences for escape all served the same purpose. A perimeter not visible, but deeply, painfully felt. A hawk circled lazily overhead, dipping lower as if surveying the same boundaries Elijah saw, though its freedom of flight made the comparison feel unkind. When he joined the others near the tool shed, the air held the faint smell of damp wood, smoke from last night's cooking fires, and the bitter iron scent of early morning sweat. No one spoke, but movements carried messages. A glance exchanged between two men suggested fatigue born from a sleepless night. A woman rubbing her wrist indicated a punishment administered the previous day, the swelling visible even in the low light. A child, too young to be assigned to the fields but old enough to understand expectations, stood beside the shed with his eyes lowered, practicing stillness as if it were a required skill. Elijah kept his gaze level, careful not to draw unnecessary attention. At 19, he had learned the precarious balance between appearing obedient and appearing capable. The former was expected, the latter was scrutinized. Competence could be interpreted as potential threat. Too much intelligence invited suspicion. Too much silence could be mistaken for defiance. Every enslaved person walked a narrow path shaped not by their own inclinations, but by the perceptions of those in power, unstable, shifting constantly, and rarely predictable. The overseer, Mr. Colton, emerged from the stable with a ledger tucked beneath his arm. He never moved quickly. His authority did not require haste. The sound of his boots across the packed earth silenced even the small, cautious movements among the group. Without lifting his head, he began reciting assignments, his voice flat, as though reading numbers rather than names. Elijah heard his sister's name, Sarah, assigned to the wash house for the week. He noted the tremor in her posture as she stepped forward to receive the instruction, though she kept her face carefully blank. The assignment was not unusual. The trembling was. A moment later, Colton's attention shifted to Elijah. Field Row 8. South Boundary. Report yields this evening. His tone was as measured as ever, but Elijah caught a fleeting glance in his direction, evaluative, almost calculating. It lasted no more than a second, but it unsettled him more than any shouted order might have. The overseer had grown unpredictable of late. There were rumors of disagreements between him and the plantation owner, whispers exchanged at night about increased patrols, stricter curfews, and unusual inventories being conducted in the main house. Elijah pushed the thought aside, though uneasily. Rumors were dangerous. They traveled quickly, but consequences traveled faster. As the group dispersed, Elijah slowed his pace, observing the slight imbalance in his sister's steps. He wanted to ask, but there were no safe moments for questions, not when cabin walls carried sound, not when fields were watched, not when even expressions could betray concern. Instead, he allowed their paths to diverge as expected, though he tracked her movement until the wash-house door swallowed her figure into its dim interior. Work in the fields began with the familiar rhythm of blades cutting through stalks, soil being turned, and the monotony of labor designed to occupy both body and mind. The sun climbed steadily, lifting the mist and revealing the settlement with a clarity that felt almost accusatory. Elijah worked with practiced precision, his movements efficient, neither rushed nor sluggish. To an uninformed observer, he might have appeared fully absorbed in the task. In truth, his attention moved constantly, to the tree-line, to the road leading toward the town, to the distant shape of a rider passing between properties, and always back to the wash house. The soil at the southern boundary held more moisture than usual, clinging to his hands as he worked. The smell of freshly turned earth mixed with the scent of pine drifting from the forest beyond the fence. Occasionally, the breeze carried distant conversations from the direction of the main house. Names spoken, items counted, instructions delivered. The tone of these exchanges felt different from previous days, heavier, as if something was being prepared behind closed doors. By midday, the heat pressed down with a force that seemed almost physical. Sweat gathered at Elijah's brow and ran into his eyes, blurring the edges of the landscape. When the brief break was called, he retreated to the thin strip of shade beside a storage shed, where a few others had already gathered. No one dared speak openly, but communication existed in other forms. A hand resting too long on a shoulder, a glance held for a second longer than necessary, a quick gesture toward the direction of a patrol rider. Elijah noticed a bruise on the arm of one of the men who usually worked near the stables. A dark, uneven mark, as if inflicted hastily and without discipline. The man shielded it with an awkward movement when he realized Elijah had seen it. Such injuries were not unusual, but the secrecy surrounding this one felt different, like something that was not meant to be known. Elijah turned his gaze back toward the fields, tucking the observation into the growing list of small, disquieting details that had accumulated over the past week. Later, as work resumed and the hours stretched into late afternoon, a new sound drifted from the far edge of the property, the distant rumble of a wagon. Wagons traveled the road often, but this one moved slowly, deliberately, the creaking of its wheels distinct against the settled stillness of the day. Elijah straightened slightly, pretending to adjust his stance, allowing him to glance toward the tree-line without appearing distracted. He saw the top of the wagon, covered with a worn canvas, and beside it rode a man unfamiliar to him. The rider and wagon paused near the main house before disappearing behind the structure. He tried to return to his work, but a faint unease clung to him. Deliveries at this hour were rare. Visits from traders rarer still. Near sunset, when the air cooled enough to breathe easily again, Elijah completed his assignment and carried the tools back to the shed. The overseer stood outside the stable once more, his ledger open, though he seemed less focused on the numbers and more on the path leading from the main house. When he lifted his head, his eyes met Elijah's for the briefest moment. There was no overt hostility there, only a guarded scrutiny, as if the young man's existence required constant evaluation. The evening bell signaled the end of labor, but freedom was not a concept associated with the hours that followed. It was simply a shift in expectations. Elijah walked with the others toward the cabins, passing the wash house where lamps glowed faintly through the narrow windows. He caught a glimpse of his sister inside, her figure bent over a tub, her movements stiff, mechanical. A woman beside her whispered something, prompting Sarah to straighten slightly, but her expression remained unreadable. Inside their cabin, the air was thick with the lingering heat of the day. Shadows stretched across the walls, distorted by the flickering of an oil lamp. Elijah's companions settled quickly, some tending to their sore hands, others preparing the small, ration meal. The cabin felt too small, too quiet, as though the walls leaned inward to press the occupants together. He ate little, his appetite dulled by the persistent sense that something unspoken hovered in the space between all of them. He could hear distant footsteps outside, the soft murmur of voices too quiet to decipher, and occasionally the heavy clank of chains being inspected or moved near the storage shed. Such inspections were usually conducted in the morning. That they were happening now felt like another anomaly in a day filled with subtle disruptions. Later, when most had succumbed to exhaustion, Elijah lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night. Frogs croaked from the marshy ground near the creek, insects droned endlessly, and the creaking of wood, always present, seemed amplified in the darkness. He replayed the day's events in his mind, his sister's trembling posture, the unexpected wagon, the bruise on the stable hand, the overseer's watchful gaze. None of these details meant anything on their own. Together, they formed a pattern he did not yet understand. The settlement slept uneasily. Somewhere in the dark, a whip cracked. Once, then silence. A warning or a punishment, he could not tell. Elijah lay still, resisting the instinct to rise or peer through the small window. Curiosity was dangerous, attention even more so. But the sound anchored itself in his mind, a stark reminder of the boundaries he could not cross. As the night deepened, a thought pressed itself into his consciousness, quiet yet insistent. Something is coming. He did not know what shape it would take, whether it would arrive with a document, an order, a sale notice, or the dawn itself. But the unease that had followed him throughout the day did not feel misplaced. It felt like the first shift in the ground beneath him, a change too subtle to name but too real to ignore. Outside, the wind rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the faintest hint of smoke from a distant fire used for cooking in the overseer's quarters. Elijah's eyes remained open long after the cabin fell silent. The oppressive stillness weighed on him like an unanswered question, and in the center of that silence was his sister's trembling hand. The days that followed unfolded with an unnatural stillness, as if the settlement itself sensed a disturbance but could not yet name it. The early summer heat settled heavier upon the fields, pressing into the lungs of those who worked from dawn until nightfall. Elijah felt the change most acutely in the way people moved, not slower, not faster, but with a caution that suggested they were bracing for something they could not yet see. Conversations shortened, glances sharpened. The air, once filled with the predictable cadence of routine, now carried the uneasy silence of people measuring each moment for signs of shift or danger. Each morning began the same. The overseer with his ledger, the lists of assignments spoken in that same dull, administrative voice, the small gestures exchanged among the enslaved workers that communicated more than any words could safely hold. Elijah searched for his sister's face each day as names were announced, noting every slight change in her posture, every hesitation in the way she stepped forward to receive instruction. She worked in the wash house still, but her movements appeared increasingly mechanical, as if a weight had settled onto her shoulders that she dared not acknowledge. It was during one of these mornings, when the sun had barely risen and the ground still held the chill of night, that Elijah caught the first unmistakable sign of what had been growing beneath the surface. The overseer paused after reciting the usual assignments and turned briefly toward the main house. A man stepped out onto the porch, a trader Elijah recognized by the cut of his coat and the polished boots that marked him as someone who did not work the land but profited from those who did. The trader spoke quietly to the plantation owner, who nodded once before turning his gaze toward the assembled workers. A subtle shift of his eyes lingered in Sarah's direction. The gesture lasted only moments, but it unearthed a dread Elijah could no longer dismiss as imagination. Later that day, near the water barrel by the midfield boundary, Elijah overheard two workers speaking in hushed tones. Their voices were low, buried under the scraping of tools and the rustling wind, but fragments reached him nonetheless. Words like inventory, ledger, and the unmistakable phrase, names for sale. One of the men glanced toward the wash house before falling silent. When he noticed Elijah approaching, he stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow as though the conversation had never taken place. The other man avoided Elijah's gaze entirely. That evening, when the cabins filled with the muted sounds of people settling into the little rest they were granted, Elijah sat near the window slit, the warm air drifting across his face. He heard footsteps outside, measured, deliberate, and then the low murmur of voices near the storage shed. He recognized the overseer's voice, speaking to someone whose tone carried a polished crispness that did not belong to anyone who lived or labored on the property. The words were difficult to discern, but a single sentence carried through the darkness. "She'll fetch a fair price, given her age and condition." The reply was too faint to restore fully, but the word departure cut through the night with the cruelty of certainty. Elijah felt his breath catch in his throat, not from surprise, but from the confirmation of what he had feared. His sister was to be sold. It was no rumor, no speculation born from unease. It was an arrangement already spoken aloud, discussed with that cold, transactional tone reserved for goods rather than for people. Sleep did not come easily to him that night. Every sound, the groan of wood as the cabin shifted in the heat, the distant cry of an animal near the tree-lean, the soft breathing of those sleeping beside him, felt disjointed, wrong. His thoughts spiraled through memories of their childhood, the way he had promised her, once, that he would always keep her safe, the afternoons spent gathering roots under their mother's watchful eye, the grief that had settled over them when she died, leaving him with a responsibility he had always carried quietly but fiercely. The idea that Sarah might be taken from the only place she had known, sent to a distant plantation, with no promise of kindness, no chance for reunion, filled Elijah with a despair that bordered on something darker. In the morning, work resumed as though nothing had changed, but Elijah noticed every detail with sharpened clarity. The trader from the previous day remained on the property, though he stayed near the main house, speaking occasionally with the overseer or inspecting the stables. His presence drew quiet glances from the enslaved workers, and their movements grew even more constrained, as if afraid their expressions might reveal too much. Children were kept closer to their parents. Women avoided lingering in open areas. Even the animals seemed unsettled, horses pacing in their enclosures, chickens scattering too quickly at the slightest noise. At midday, Elijah crossed paths with Sarah near the well. She carried a bucket of water, her arms trembling slightly from the weight, though she tried to hide the effort. He offered no direct greeting. Such exchanges were discouraged, but he paused just long enough for her to lift her eyes to his. In that brief moment, he saw the confirmation he had been dreading. She knew, whether she had overheard something, been told outright, or sensed the tension gathering around her like a tightening net, she understood what was coming. Her lips parted as though she meant to speak, but she closed them again, glancing nervously toward the overseer's distant silhouette. Instead, she made a small motion with her hand, a gesture their mother had taught them, used only in moments when words could bring danger. It meant not here. It meant later. It meant I'm afraid. Elijah nodded almost imperceptibly before returning to his assigned row. The pressure of secrecy settled upon him like an unwelcome cloak. Every thought had to be contained, every movement calculated. He observed people more closely now, searching for any sign of betrayal, intentional or accidental. One of the older men, desperate to preserve what little stability he had left, spoke too freely with the overseer. A young woman, exhausted from sleepless nights, let her expression linger too long on the traitor's figure. Even the children seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, their games subdued, their laughter nearly absent. Days passed with this tightening silence, each one bringing Elijah closer to an unspoken threshold. He knew the moment of decision approached, though he did not yet know what form it would take. His mind churned with possibilities, none safe, none simple. Escape was nearly impossible with the patrols. Negotiation with the owner or overseer would be futile. Pleas from an enslaved man held no weight in matters of profit. Violence, even in defense of family, carried consequences not only for him, but for anyone suspected of assisting or even knowing. Yet the thought persisted. If he did nothing, she would be gone forever. The turning point came on a humid afternoon thick with the scent of impending rain. Elijah had been sent to the smaller storage shed near the southern fence to retrieve replacement handles for the field tools. The shed was rarely used, its interior cluttered with items long neglected, broken equipment, old barrels, fragments of rope stiffened by time. As he reached for one of the handles, he heard voices just outside, muffled but close enough that he dared not move. It was the traitor, identifiable by his clipped speech, and with him was the overseer. Departure in 2 weeks at most, the traitor said. We must finalize the ledger by tomorrow. And the brother? The overseer asked. A pause. As long as he does not interfere, the traitor answered. He is of no consequence. But keep an eye on him. Men like that, quiet, observant, they are the ones who break before you expect it. The overseer gave a low hum of agreement. He has sense, Colton muttered. But blood ties make fools of sensible men. Their footsteps shifted, their voices fading as they moved back toward the main house. Elijah did not move for several minutes. His breath felt trapped in his chest, his fingers stiff around the wooden handle. He had known, but hearing the words spoken plainly, his sister scheduled for sale, himself treated as a variable to be managed, hardened something inside him. The decision, once a nebulous fear-born instinct, crystallized into something sharper, more resolute. He would not allow Sarah to be taken. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, he would act. That evening, when the workers gathered near the cabins for the final meal of the day, he noticed one man watching him too closely. A younger worker, slim, quiet, with a history of seeking favor from the overseer in exchange for small privileges, slightly larger rations, minor leniencies. Elijah felt the weight of the man's stare, but did not return it. Suspicion was a dangerous seed. Once planted, it took root quickly. He lowered his gaze, maintaining the practiced neutrality that had kept him alive thus far. But he understood now that he could not rely on silence alone. He would need to act carefully, quietly, without drawing attention from either the overseer or those who might betray him for their own survival. Later, after the cabins had gone dark, Sarah slipped inside Elijah silently. She sat beside him, her eyes weary, her hands trembling in her lap. In the dim light of the shared lantern, she whispered the truth he already knew. I heard them, she said. They said I'm leaving before the next moon. Elijah felt a cold stillness settle over him. He listened until she finished speaking, then placed his hand over hers, steadying it. Their mother's gesture returned to him, unbidden, a quiet vow, made without words. I will not let this happen. She saw the resolve in his eyes, and though fear still clung to her, a faint glimmer of relief flickered across her face. Outside, patrol footsteps moved slowly across the perimeter. The night air pressed thick through the cracks in the cabin walls. Elijah remained awake long after Sarah had returned to her quarters, staring into the darkness as the shape of his plan began to form. It was fragile, dangerous, and incomplete, but it was more than he had allowed himself to conceive only days before. By dawn, he knew with absolute clarity that the path ahead held no safety, only choice, and he had made his. The weeks that followed settled over Elijah like a lengthening shadow, unseen in its full shape, yet unmistakable in its advance. What had begun as a silent resolve now coalesced into planning, each thought edged with urgency, each action measured against the narrowing window of time before Sarah's scheduled departure. The plantation moved through its daily routine with the same outward rhythm, but Elijah perceived the shifts beneath the surface. Conversations truncated when he approached, the overseer's increased scrutiny, the trader's occasional returns to finalize arrangements. Even the air itself seemed weighted with expectation. Humidity clung to every surface, making the cabin smell of damp wood and stale breath. Smoke from the cooking fires lingered longer than usual, drifting low across the fields like a warning he could neither escape nor ignore. Elijah began by observing. He studied the routines of the night patrols, noting their routes, their intervals of inattentiveness, the small moments when fatigue dulled their vigilance. He paid attention to the storage buildings, their contents, their locks, the way dried kindling was stacked in corners forgotten by most. He noticed how the wind shifted across the property each evening, carrying the scent of burning logs from the main house's chimney toward the slave quarters. Such details, once dismissed as background, now formed the architecture of his thoughts. He needed to understand the landscape not as a place of labor, but as a series of weaknesses, pathways, and potential ruptures. Yet obstacles arose at every turn. The overseer's ledger grew thicker with entries that spoke, in their cold administrative tone, of imminent transactions. Elijah managed to glimpse one such page when the overseer inadvertently left the book on a stool outside the smokehouse. The writing was precise, almost elegant. Female, aged 17, condition sound. Departure scheduled, August 3rd. The date chilled Elijah more than any winter wind. It formalized what he had feared, turning possibility into certainty. He closed the ledger quietly, careful not to disturb its placement, but the words burned into him with a permanence ink could not fully capture. Sarah, meanwhile, moved through her days with a steadiness that belied the terror he knew she carried. At night, when they managed brief, covert meetings behind the cabins, her hands trembled as she spoke. She had started hearing whispers, an itinerant trader passing through, a neighbor plantation seeking additional labor, rumors of cruelty on the place she might be sent. Elijah listened, burdened by the knowledge that he could offer no reassurance. He merely tightened his jaw and told her, quietly but firmly, that he would act. She believed him. Her trust cut deeper than any threat. Around them, paranoia crept through the enslaved community like a slow-moving sickness. People watched each other too closely, interpreting every gesture as potential danger. Elijah sensed that some suspected he was planning something. A few looked at him with wary sympathy, others with calculated distance, as if weighing the risks of aligning themselves with a man whose desperation might endanger them all. The young worker who had once watched Elijah with too much interest now avoided him entirely, either out of fear or because the overseer had taken notice and warned him away. Elijah could not determine which possibility troubled him more. The tension reached a subtle crescendo one evening when Elijah attempted to retrieve old rope from the stable loft under the guise of repairing tools. The stable boy, a frail child no older than 12, lingered at the entrance, watching Elijah with wide, uncertain eyes. His hands fidgeted with a bit of twine, twisting it until it cut into his skin. Elijah spoke gently, trying to ease the child's fear, but the boy backed away, murmuring that he had been told to mind who he helps or suffers for it. His voice trembled, and Elijah recognized in it the same fear that had begun to root itself in nearly everyone. The boy disappeared before Elijah could say more, leaving Elijah alone with the dim lantern and the creeping certainty that trust was a rarer commodity than time. As the days wore on, Elijah's internal landscape shifted. The dread that had once paralyzed him now fused with a hardening resolve. He no longer questioned whether violence would be necessary. He only questioned how far it must go. At night, lying awake beneath the oppressive heat, he heard the faint crackle of fire from the main house's chimney, a harmless domestic sound, yet one that filled his mind with possibilities. He imagined flames moving where they did not belong, feeding on dry timber, spreading faster than any man could contain. The thought frightened him, not because of the destruction it implied, but because he felt his own heart responding not with revulsion, but with grim recognition. Fire was a risk, a beacon, a weapon. It was the one force he believed could disrupt the machinery of sail and transport long enough to seize a moment of escape. The turning point arrived with the suddenness of a blow. A dispute broke out between two enslaved men in the fields, an argument born, Elijah suspected, not from genuine grievance, but from pressure building beyond human tolerance. The overseer intervened with characteristic brutality, striking one man repeatedly before the assembled workers. Elijah stood among them, jaw clenched, breath shallow. When the overseer's gaze swept across the crowd, it halted briefly on Elijah, as though sensing a shift in him. Elijah met the stare without lowering his eyes. The overseer stepped toward him, lifting the whip slightly, not yet striking but testing boundaries. "You look restless," he said. "Mind yourself." Elijah nodded once, but something in his measured calm must have unsettled the man, who after a long moment turned away. That evening, Elijah discovered another confirmation of the tightening timeline. A wagon stood near the main house, partially loaded with crates bearing small chalk marks he recognized from previous sales. A woman nearby whispered a prayer under her breath, rocking a child in her arms. Elijah pretended to adjust the straps of his work apron while listening, catching fragments of her words, "Deliver us, protect her, not again." The tone of her prayer carried the weary cadence of someone who had witnessed too many departures, too many separations that time could never mend. The mechanism of the coming fire revealed itself slowly, pieced together from observation rather than intention. Elijah noticed that the storage shed near the southern fence, rarely attended, poorly maintained, contained several barrels of pitch used to seal wagon wheels. The substance was thick, flammable, prone to igniting even under minimal provocation. Moreover, the shed's door did not close cleanly, leaving a gap through which night air slipped, carrying the faint scent of resin and wood rot. Elijah filed these details away with a calm that frightened even him. But no plan could proceed without cost. Elijah began avoiding unnecessary contact with others, not out of distrust alone, but out of a desire to spare them association should matters turn violent. This distance strained relationships that had formed through years of shared suffering. One older woman, who had once treated him with maternal warmth, now studied him with a sorrowful understanding, as though recognizing the path he had chosen and mourning what it would demand of him. Others whispered in corners, uncertain whether to fear Elijah's silence or to rely on it. Nights grew louder with insects, their ceaseless buzzing filling the darkness like a feverish chorus. Smoke from evening fires drifted through the quarters, settling into clothing and hair until everything smelled faintly of char. Elijah lay awake for hours, his mind tracing the steps of his plan, how long the fire would take to spread, how quickly panic would dismantle order, how much time he would have to reach Sarah once the chaos began. Each scenario brought new anxieties, new ethical fractures. The price of failure was unthinkable. The price of success, equally heavy. He found himself writing once, an act he rarely risked, on a scrap of paper hidden beneath the floorboard. The words were not for anyone but himself, a crude attempt to release the weight pressing on his chest. If I do nothing, I condemn her. If I act, I condemn myself. He tore the paper in half, then quarters, burning the pieces silently over a candle flame before extinguishing it. Late one night, while gathering water, Elijah overheard two men praying behind the smokehouse. Their voices carried in the still air, speaking of deliverance, of fear, of the fire that consumes but also clears. One man mentioned dreams, visions of smoke rising beyond the trailing. Elijah's stomach tightened at the coincidence, though he forced himself to step quietly past, unwilling to let his reaction betray anything. By the time Sarah's departure approached with suffocating nearness, confirmed by the trader's most recent visit and the overseer's increased vigilance, Elijah's plan had taken full shape. Every detail had been rehearsed in his mind, every risk acknowledged, every potential failure weighted and accepted. There was no turning back. Not now. The weeks of preparation had stripped him of the luxury of hesitation. The emotional cost, shame, dread, the creeping awareness that violence corrodes even righteous intention, wrapped around him like a second skin. He carried it with him through the fields, through the nights, through every waking moment. And as another humid dusk settled over the plantation, with the low hum of insects vibrating through the stifling air, Elijah understood with grim clarity. The fire was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The night before the fire did not arrive with any particular omen, nor with any celestial disturbance that might have warned those who lived within the town's narrow radius of wooden houses and clay roads. It came as nights usually did, blank, indifferent, saturated with the humidity that rolled down from the nearby wetlands and collected along the edges of roofs like sweat. The cicadas shrilled without pause, and the darkness thickened in the low spaces between stables, sheds, and storage barns. Yet something in the air had hardened, not a sound, not a sight, but a kind of pressure that inhabitants sensed without explanation. Even the overseers walked with shorter steps, as though unwilling to disturb whatever lay coiling in the silence around them. Elijah felt it most distinctly in the hollow between his ribs, as if the last remnants of hesitation were being compressed into something dense and immovable. The date had been set. The plan, traced and retraced in his mind for weeks, had finally condensed into a single, irreversible direction. Once moved upon, it would end everything: his safety, his anonymity, perhaps even his life. But this was no longer the point. The point had narrowed to a single line. His sister was leaving at dawn 2 mornings later. And fire, silent at first, then all-consuming, was the only force that could fracture the machinery that moved her away. There was nothing heroic in the hours that preceded the act. Elijah's hands shook when he tied the knots of the small bundles he had prepared, containing nothing more than flint, cloth, and bits of oil-saturated rags scavenged from the workshop. He had practiced the knots until they were exact. He could tie them even in darkness. But now the strands seemed to resist him, snagging against the calluses that had thickened his fingers over years of labor. He hid the materials in the hollow space beneath the eastern shed, where broken tools and discarded planks created a pocket large enough to conceal anything without drawing attention. Twice he thought he saw movement in the corner of his eye, another enslaved worker, perhaps, or one of the patrols that prowled the grounds after dusk. But each time, when he turned his head, there was nothing but the trembling shadow of a lantern swaying from its hook near the smokehouse. He told no one, not even Ruth. If she sensed the urgency in his expression earlier that morning, she asked nothing. Silence had long been the only reliable language between them. A single look could communicate more than a spoken sentence ever could in a world where every overheard word carried the potential for punishment. She had spent the day packing her small belongings under supervision: 2 dresses, a shawl, a small wooden comb. She did not know, not exactly, what Elijah planned, only that he was planning something and that he might not survive it. When they crossed paths near the well, she pressed her fingers briefly into his palm, a gesture that was neither permission nor plea, simply recognition. She understood that the world was closing in and that only one of them had the strength to pry it open. By midnight, the final preparations had been made. Elijah sat behind the stables with his back against the rough wooden boards, listening to the rhythmic snoring of animals and the dull thud of a restless hoof striking the stall floor. He breathed slowly, willing his heartbeat to settle into a manageable pattern. He knew the layout perfectly now: the dry beams, the crooked alignment of the rafters, the way the hay had accumulated in uneven piles near the entrance. The season's dryness had hardened the straw to a brittle texture that crackled at the slightest touch. He thought of all the inventory lists he had seen nailed to the posts near the overseer's quarters, numbers representing horses, tools, sacks of corn, everything reducible to quantity. And somewhere, on a different piece of paper, Ruth's name existed only as an entry assigned a price. Fire would erase all of it, he thought, or at least obscure it long enough. He waited nearly an hour before rising to his feet. The patrols usually completed their circuit around the perimeter half an hour past midnight, lingering near the main house to exchange brief reports. This gap, small, predictable, was the window upon which he relied. Moving slowly to avoid making the boards creak, Elijah slipped behind the shed and retrieved the bundles. The night had grown colder, and he felt the chill in his joints as he crouched near the barn wall and struck the first spark. A faint glow flickered, then steadied. He pressed the lit rag into the hollow gap between 2 beams where dry fibers of hay gathered like kindling. He did not think of consequences. He did not imagine the scene that would unfold. He only thought of time, how much he needed, how little he had. At first the flame barely grew. It moved lazily, licking upward in thin tendrils. Elijah stepped back, watching, waiting for the moment the fire caught properly. It came suddenly, as though inhaling a breath of air. The small flicker surged into a broader stroke of light that slid across the grain of the wood and ignited it. Within seconds, the heat intensified. He felt it against his face, a warmth that expanded outward like a physical wall. He turned quickly, moving toward the second barn, then the storage shed, repeating the act with meticulous precision. 3 points of ignition, staggered just enough to overwhelm any attempt at early suppression. The night began to shift around him. Smoke rose in thin blue threads, then thickened into darker plumes. The animals sensed the change long before the humans did. A horse let out a loud, panicked whinny that echoed across the yard. The first shout erupted minutes later, from one of the field hands who had been sleeping near the back porch of the main house. His voice cracked the quiet, followed by a second and third alarm. Lanterns flared into light. Doors swung open. The orderly rhythm of the plantation dissolved instantly into confusion. Overseers ran in different directions, shouting commands that contradicted one another. The patrols abandoned their measured routines and converged toward the growing blaze. Elijah ducked behind the nearest stack of barrels, using the smoke as partial cover. His lungs burned, but he forced himself to breathe shallowly. He could not afford to cough. Not yet. The fire spread faster than he had anticipated. The wind, unpredictable for weeks, chose this night to gather strength, pushing the flames horizontally along the barn roof, sending sparks skipping across the yard like small, fleeing insects. A wooden beam cracked loudly, collapsing inward with a shower of embers. The light illuminated faces distorted by fear. The overseer Thompson shouting orders while clutching a bucket. The stable boy crying as he attempted to free one of the horses. A woman rushing out of her quarters with a blanket over her head. Everyone moved in frantic, intersecting lines, as though an invisible force had severed the logic that normally governed their movements. Elijah used the chaos to advance toward the small row of sleeping quarters where Ruth was confined for the night. He kept low, avoiding the sharp, white light of the lanterns. His mind tunneled into a single thought: reach her door, unfasten the iron latch, guide her out through the corridor behind the smokehouse. But the smoke grew thicker by the minute, carrying with it the scent of burning timber mixed with something else, an acrid undertone he did not want to identify. His eyes stung. Tears blurred the lines of the buildings. Still he pushed forward. Halfway across the yard, he heard a sound that made him freeze, the unmistakable metallic click of a rifle being readied. Elijah pressed himself against the shadowed side of a wagon, holding his breath. Two patrolmen passed close by, their faces slick with sweat, their expressions stretched thin with panic. "Someone started this," one of them said between labored breaths. "This ain't an accident." "Find who's missing," the other replied. "Check every quarter. They'll still be close." The words struck Elijah like a blow. They were already searching for a culprit. His window was shrinking rapidly. He waited until their footsteps receded before slipping out again, weaving through the dark. A group of enslaved workers ran past him toward the well, carrying tin pails of water that sloshed violently with each step. Their faces revealed not only fear but also calculation. Each person silently weighing what they were expected to do, what they could safely refuse, and what punishment might follow either choice. Horror here was not the fire alone. It lived in the calculus forced upon every witness. When Elijah reached Ruth's quarters, he found the door unguarded, a rare stroke of fortune amidst the turmoil. He pulled on the metal latch, ignoring the heat that seared his palm. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by the faint orange glow filtering through the window. Ruth sat on her cot, wide awake, her back straight, her hands clenched in her lap. She did not gasp or cry when she saw him. She simply stood. "Elijah," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the noise outside. "You did this." He did not answer. There was no need. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and hurried forward. Together they moved through the corridor, keeping close to the wall. The smoke outside had thickened enough to conceal them partially, but it also made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Elijah wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and guided Ruth toward the smokehouse, where a narrow passage behind the water barrels led to a small gate used to transport supplies. It was their only exit. They reached the passage just as the main barn collapsed in a thunderous crash. The roar of falling timber drowned out every other sound. Sparks shot into the air, carried high by the heat. Elijah shielded Ruth with his body as debris rained down in the yard. A horse broke free from its stall and bolted wildly past them, nearly knocking them over. Voices rose in disjointed cries, commands, accusations, pleas. Someone yelled that the flames were moving toward the corn storage. Another shouted that the patrol captain had been injured. Fear was no longer contained. It had spilled into every corner of the plantation, turning people into frantic silhouettes moving in unpredictable patterns. Elijah placed his hand on the small gate and pushed, but it barely moved. Panic flared inside his chest. He pressed harder, straining his muscles, forcing the rusted hinge to groan in protest. Finally it gave way, opening just wide enough for them to slip through. Beyond the gate lay a narrow trail leading into the woods. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying in the rising wind. Elijah turned back only once, seeing the plantation engulfed in a churning mass of orange and black. For a moment, the scene resembled one of the drawings he had once glimpsed in a discarded almanac, an engraving of a burning settlement, rendered with painstaking detail. Except this was not a drawing. This was the culmination of every unbearable moment that had led him here. They moved down the trail quickly, though every step felt heavier than the last. Ruth stumbled once, coughing violently, and Elijah caught her by the arm. Her breath rattled in her chest. The heat from the fire still pressed against their backs, even at this distance. Branches cracked under their feet, and the leaves rustled in agitation. It felt as though the entire forest had awakened, listening, waiting to decide whether to shield them or betray them. Behind them, the shouts grew louder. Someone had noticed the open gate. Elijah pulled Ruth deeper into the woods, ignoring the sharp sting of thorns against his ankles. The darkness thickened, and the uneven ground forced them to slow their pace. He knew the patrols would follow. They had dogs, lanterns, weapons. The fire gave them reason to abandon protocol, reason to hunt with desperation rather than order. Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs, driven by fear and something sharper, guilt. Ruth stopped suddenly, gripping his wrist. "Elijah, what have you done?" He did not answer. He could not. The truth pressed against him with the weight of the smoke still lingering in his lungs. He had destroyed the only world they had ever known, not because it was home, but because it had been a cage. He had crossed a threshold no one crossed without consequence. And yet, in Ruth's question, he heard not accusation but terror. Terror at the unknown future, terror at the price of freedom. They reached a clearing where the moonlight filtered through the branches in fractured beams. Elijah guided Ruth toward a fallen log where she could rest. He scanned the woods, listening for signs of pursuit. The fire's glow flickered through the trees behind them, shifting like a distant storm. Voices approached, faint, inconsistent, but growing clearer. The patrols were dividing into groups. "Elijah," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling now. "Will they kill us?" He hesitated, too long, and that silence served as answer. The woods erupted with the sound of snapping branches. Lantern light bobbed in the darkness, drawing nearer. Elijah pulled Ruth to her feet, forcing her onward. The terrain sloped downward toward a small creek, its shallow water glinting under the moon. If they could reach the creek and follow it, they might evade the trackers for a time. But their pursuers were closing the distance quickly, far more quickly than Elijah had hoped. Ruth's breath became ragged. Elijah's vision blurred at the edges. The weight of the night pressed against them. Smoke, fear, exhaustion, the moral burden of an act that could not be undone. Every tree seemed to lean inward, as though witnessing the unfolding of a tragedy they had seen many times before. When they finally reached the creek, Elijah stepped into the cold water and pulled Ruth beside him. The shock jolted them both, but it dulled the scent of smoke clinging to their clothes. They walked along the creek bed, water splashing softly around their ankles. Behind them, the shouts grew louder, angrier. Someone fired a shot into the air. The sound cracked like a jagged tear through the forest. Ruth stumbled again, falling to her knees in the water. Elijah pulled her up, but she shook her head, panting. "I can't, Elijah, I can't anymore." "You have to," he whispered. "Just a little farther." Another shot rang out, closer this time. Ruth's eyes widened with terror. "They'll catch us." Elijah swallowed hard. His voice came out strained. "Not if we keep moving." But he wasn't sure. Not anymore. They pressed on, following the creek as it curved around a cluster of stones. The lanterns behind them flickered and multiplied. 3, 4, maybe 5. The patrols shouted instructions, their voices cutting through the darkness with brutal clarity. "Elijah," Ruth whispered again, but this time her tone had changed. Softer, almost resigned. "If they take you, what will happen to me?" He stopped walking. The creek water flowed around their legs in gentle currents. Elijah stared at his sister, his chest heaving. In her eyes he saw fear. Yes, but also a terrible understanding. One that had been forming since the moment she realized he was the cause of the fire. He opened his mouth to speak, but the woods answered for him. The dogs had caught their scent. A howl rose in the distance, long and sharp. Ruth flinched. Elijah grabbed her hand and pulled her forward, but the second howl was closer, much closer. The lanterns glowed like approaching stars, weaving through the trees. The fire he had started was still burning behind them, reducing structures and memories to ash. Yet here, in the dark woods, a different kind of burning began, a recognition that their fate now balanced on the thinnest possible thread. Elijah had chosen violence to save a life, and now violence was coming for him, carried by men who believed they were the rightful guardians of order. He moved faster, dragging Ruth forward, pushing through branches that clawed at their clothes. His breath tore at his throat. The creek water splashed loudly beneath them. Lantern light flared against the trees behind them, too close now to ignore. "Elijah!" Ruth cried out as she stumbled again. He turned back, gripping her shoulders, forcing her upright. "Keep going," he said hoarsely. "Keep going, Ruth. Don't stop." But even as he said it, he knew Part 5 was waiting for them, waiting with the cold inevitability of history itself. And the fire, illuminating the horizon like a second sun, had already sealed the trajectory of everything that would follow. Understood. Here is Part 5, written in the same documentary horror, archival, elegiac tone, approximately 2,000 words, in long, dense paragraphs, with slow reflective pacing, historical documentary texture, and a final YouTube-style reflection. Part 5, Resolution, Reflection, and Legacy, almost equals 2,000 words, somber, reflective, archival, elegiac. The days following the fire arrived not with the clarity of aftermath, but with a haze of smoke that hung over the town like an unsettled accusation. The wind carried the smell of charred wood and something darker, something that seeped into clothing, lingered in hair, and clung to the interior walls of every surviving structure. People walked through the streets with lowered voices, pausing frequently to glance at the blackened ruins as though expecting them to speak. And in a sense, they did. The barns and stables, reduced to skeletal frames of scorched timber, offered no shelter from the questions that circulated through the community. Who was responsible? Who had something to gain? Why had no one predicted it? Why had no one prevented it? The answers shifted depending on who was speaking and who was listening. And soon the fire was not merely an event but a narrative, one that different factions struggled to claim or conceal. Elijah's fate hung in the air as tightly as the smoke. In the immediate hours after the two siblings disappeared into the woods, patrols scoured the perimeter with the urgency of men whose authority had been challenged in the most public and humiliating manner. They found footprints along the creek bed, traces of disturbed soil, fragments of cloth caught on brambles. But the trail dissolved near a bend in the waterway where heavy rain had washed away the evidence. A search party followed the creek northward for nearly 2 miles before turning back at dusk, exhausted and irritated. Some believed Elijah and Ruth had drowned in the creek's deeper pockets. Others argued that they had fled toward the marshes, where snakes, mud, and thick reeds would claim them long before any rescue attempt could. A smaller group murmured, always in private, always in low tones, that perhaps they had succeeded, that perhaps the flames had not been the end but the beginning of something else. The plantation itself became a wound the town did not know how to treat. Its owner, Mr. Halston, moved stiffly through the wreckage, his face a mask of disbelief and simmering indignation. He spoke publicly of rebuilding, of restoring order, of punishing those responsible with such severity that no one would dare repeat the offense. But privately, within the confines of a parlor still clouded with the smell of smoke, he staggered beneath the weight of financial loss. Insurance inspectors arrived, recording the damage in ledgers with crisp handwriting that lacked emotional inflection. They asked perfunctory questions about the cause of the fire, but their pens hesitated whenever the topic drifted towards sabotage. An accidental spark in the hay, they suggested, would resolve the matter far more neatly than an intentional act of rebellion. And so official documents gradually bent toward that narrative. An unfortunate accident, a confluence of dry weather and careless storage, a tragedy without malice. But testimonies from enslaved workers told a different story. Whispered conversations drifted through the survivors' quarters at night. Details spoken cautiously, generously coated with uncertainty, yet carrying the undertone of something shared, something known. A man named Jacob insisted he had seen Elijah slip behind the stables hours before the fire started. A woman countered that she had seen nothing unusual except the nervous pacing of the overseers, which she found suspicious. Others said the fire had been too coordinated, too precise, too simultaneous in its points of origin to be anything but deliberate. And then there were those who refused to speak at all, their silence both shield and testament. The truth, fragmented into conflicting shards, dissolved into rumor, and rumor hardened into the kind of legend that communities used to understand their own failures. Ruth's name appeared only once in the written documents of the aftermath, in a brief report stating that she had gone missing under uncertain circumstances and was presumed taken or deceased. No further inquiry followed. In the unspoken hierarchy of concerns, she ranked far below the reconstruction of the barns, the accounting of destroyed livestock, and the recalculation of labor needed to restore productivity. Yet among the enslaved population, her absence left a fissure. Some mourned her quietly. Others avoided the topic entirely, as though mentioning her name might summon punishment. The younger children listened at doorways, piecing together fragments of adult conversations, and began reciting stories in hushed tones, stories in which Ruth became a figure both tragic and mythic, crossing forests, rivers, and thresholds between known and unknown worlds. In the weeks that followed, the town attempted to reassemble itself. Carpenters from neighboring counties were summoned to rebuild the structures. Piles of fresh timber were brought in, neatly stacked beside the ruins. The rhythmic pounding of hammers became the town's new heartbeat, steady and unfeeling. Overseers resumed their duties with heightened vigilance, patrolling the fields with tightened jaws and quickened tempers. Every misstep, however minor, was interpreted as potential rebellion. Those who had once been allowed small freedoms, walking unaccompanied between quarters, lingering near the well after sunset, found those privileges abruptly revoked. The memory of the fire had not passed. It had calcified into a mandate for stricter control. Yet something else, quieter, also began shifting beneath the surface. A few of the white townspeople, particularly those whose houses had been nearly touched by the fire, found themselves reconsidering the boundaries of their moral comfort. They did not speak openly of empathy. Such sentiments, if present, remained buried beneath layers of social expectation. But they asked questions privately. What sort of desperation drives a person to destroy the only structures that ensure their survival? What conditions must exist for a young man to believe that fire is his only language of protest? These questions, though rarely voiced, flickered at the edges of their consciousness like embers refusing to die out. Meanwhile, Some of the enslaved workers reacted with a complex blend of fear and quiet admiration. Elijah's act, if indeed it had been his, represented something forbidden and dangerous, yet undeniably bold. The moral calculus of survival was not one-sided. While some saw the fire as recklessness that endangered everyone, others saw it as the only act available to a man stripped of every other form of agency. Their interpretations varied not only by personal experience, but also by proximity to trauma. Those who had lost belongings or saw loved ones injured leaned toward resentment. Those who had suffered quietly for years felt something closer to vicarious freedom, even if fleeting. No one, however, could escape the long-term impact. The fire's smoke continued to cling to the town's memory in ways that ink could not fully capture. Letters written in the months afterward, by merchants, travelers, and distant relatives, mentioned the fire only in passing, often with vague descriptors meant to soften the unsettling truth. A regrettable event occurred, one letter stated, which prompted temporary disorder but has since been addressed. Another mentioned a disturbance brought on by certain individuals whose whereabouts remain unclear. The language of documentation smoothed the jagged edges of reality, filing away complexity until only a palatable version remained. But diaries, those private, seldom shared relics, told a different story. A local midwife described waking to the sight of flames reaching skyward like hands in prayer. A schoolteacher wrote that she heard a terrible crying, not from one voice but many, as though the night itself was begging to be spared. A visiting tradesman confessed that he had felt a chill that no fire could warm, sensing that the true horror of the night was not the destruction of buildings but the human choices that had led to it. These personal accounts, scattered across drawers and attics, would one day form the skeleton of a history far more complex than any official report. As for Elijah and Ruth, their disappearance evolved into a story shaped not by evidence, but by the needs of those who told it. Some claimed they had been captured days later, though no bodies or records substantiated this claim. Others insisted that sympathetic travelers had ferried them northward, hiding them in wagons and storage barrels. A few whispered that Elijah had sacrificed himself to divert the patrols, allowing Ruth to escape alone. And then there were those who believed the siblings had perished together in the woods, claiming that the forest itself swallowed them, with indifference, with mercy, or with hunger, depending on the teller's worldview. Weeks turned into months. The rebuilt barns stood taller than the ones before. They were bright and new, lacking the weathered texture that had made the old ones seem inevitable. The plantation resumed its operations, though productivity lagged in the shadow of the lingering unease. Some of the overseers left their posts, claiming the work had become too dangerous. New overseers arrived, stricter but less familiar with the workers' unspoken rhythms, causing a fresh wave of tension. The slaves moved through their days with increased vigilance, aware that every action was being scrutinized with renewed suspicion. In time, the story of the fire became a cautionary tale, invoked by those in power to reinforce obedience, and whispered by those oppressed as a reminder of the cost of resistance. The fire was no longer simply an event. It was a symbol, a wound, a boundary. For some it represented betrayal, for others sacrifice. But for everyone it became part of the landscape of memory. And eventually, years later, decades later, the fire would enter the realm of folklore. Older generations passed down versions of the story to children who had not been alive when it occurred. Some embellished the tale with supernatural elements, insisting that Elijah had been guided by phantom voices or that the flames themselves had moved unnaturally fast, as though hungry for justice. Others told it plainly, stripping it of ornamentation, focusing instead on the human cruelty that had precipitated it. The truth, as always, receded into the background, overshadowed by the needs of the present. One diary entry, written nearly 20 years after the event, contained the most telling reflection. The author, a schoolteacher now grown old, wrote, "We speak of the fire as though it were a storm that passed, but storms do not choose. A man chose, a man acted, and we, who lived through it, continue to choose each day whether to remember him with fear or with understanding. I do not know which choice is correct. Perhaps neither. Perhaps both." This entry, discovered long after the teacher's death, would later be cited in accounts attempting to reconstruct the emotional climate of the time. It captured the essence of the fire's legacy, the moral ambiguity that resisted neat categorization. And now, viewing this story through the lens of the present day, the modern observer is forced to confront the same unresolved questions that haunted the people of that era. History, after all, does not erase moral conflict. It preserves it. Final reflection to the modern viewer. In YouTube-style documentary narration, when we look back at Elijah's story, from the rigid hierarchy of early 19th century Virginia to the night the barns burned, we are left with a question that transcends the archival pages and stands uncomfortably close to our own present. What does justice look like when every lawful avenue has been closed? Elijah's act was destructive, violent, and unforgiving, but it arose from a world built on destruction, violence, and unforgiving laws. His choices were shaped by the absence of choice. And Ruth's disappearance, whether into the shadows of the forest or into the folds of legend, reminds us that history often loses the voices it most needed to preserve. So as we tell this story now, across centuries, across screens, across the fragile space between documentation and imagination, we are left with the enduring question: how much can one person burn in order to save even a single life? And what does history choose to remember afterward?